The year is 1940. Lucy O'Reilly Schell sits on the last ocean liner to depart Italy for the United States of America before World War II completely engulfs the European continent. Accompanying her are some of European Grand Prix racing stars, 2 Maseratis, her young son Harry, and a dream. She intends to win the Indianapolis 500. It's a dream deferred by the death of her beloved husband Laury in a road accident, an accident that left Lucy with injuries she's still nursing on that ship. It's a dream nearly brought to a screaming halt by war, a dream she won't be able to realize from the pits of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, because even though she's a team owner, women are banned lest they distract the men. It is a dream that will not come true, but Lucy O'Reilly Schell is not the kind of woman to worry about those things. After all, she fielded the quiet Delahaye that, with Jewish driver René Dreyfus behind the wheel, defeated the might of Nazi Germany's repressively dominant Mercedes and auto union teams at the 1938 Pau Grand Prix. This month on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, we're investigating the exceptional life of Lucy O'Reilly Schell, a French-born American racing driver turned team owner who did her best to bring glory to French automakers during the build-up to the Second World War. Motorsport has always existed on a razor-thin edge, where brilliance meets obsession and the pursuit of speed sends great men to their graves. Behind the podiums and champagne, behind the PR gloss and corporate smiles, racing has always carried its share of somber secrets. Welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, an award-winning motorsport history podcast dedicated to uncovering the scandals, tragedies, and intrigues that transformed the racing world in ways the record books have long tried to forget. I'm motorsport journalist and historian Elizabeth Blackstock, and in each episode I return to the archives, examining interviews, court documents, original reporting, and eyewitness accounts to reconstruct how these forgotten events unfolded. I want to know the motivations, the conflicts, and the consequences, which reveal how personal ambition and organizational pressure collided in often fatal ways that altered motorsport forever. These are our deadly passions, our terrible joys. Lucy O'Reilly Schell was destined for an international glamour no matter where she went. American by birth, Irish by heritage, and French in every sense that mattered, Lucy Marie Jean O'Reilly could have whiled away her best years in the twinkling salons of Paris. But instead, she headed to the racetrack. Her grandparents had emigrated to the United States from Ireland to find respite from the Great Famine, where potato blight wiped out the nation's staple crop and resulted in the deaths of millions of Irish citizens, the departure of millions more, and political unrest that killed others. In America, Lucy O'Reilly Schell's grandparents were able to start again, and with great results. One of their children, Francis Patrick O'Reilly, founded his own construction business in adulthood that gave him the capital to invest in factories near Reading, Pennsylvania. His business acumen proved sharp because he became a wealthy man by age 46. And like so many wealthy Americans of the era, he spent quite a lot of time in France. It was there where Francis met a woman named Henriette Celestine Roudet in a quiet Parisian suburb called Bruneuil. The two fell in love and were married in January of 1896. 9 months later, their only child was born, a beautiful daughter they named Lucy. Lucy O'Reilly was the daughter of the nouveau riche and had absolutely no qualms about embracing it as she spent her childhood flitting between France and the United States. One biographer wrote, "While she grew up in the United States and absorbed its spirit of independence, she remained unmistakably Irish both in looks and temperament, combining a natural charm and vivacity with headstrong courage, obstinate determination, and a careless outspokenness." Ask her where she was from, and she would tell you the United States, though she also was never afraid to point out that in Paris, when one is not French, one is a foreigner. We know very little about the details of her upbringing, but we do know that she was one of the many wealthy women who were allowed the luxury of embarking on a grand tour. A grand tour was a very popular way for folks of means, particularly ones from England, to get a so-called real-world education. They would travel to the European continent, bouncing from the salons of one cultured city to the next to develop a greater appreciation for art, culture, language, and history, all while rubbing elbows with the international elite. It was a practice that was far more common in the centuries prior, and particularly for young men, but the audacious Lucy O'Reilly would be denied nothing. at least until war broke out. We aren't quite sure exactly where a young Lucy was traveling in 1914 when Gavrilo Princip shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand and kicked off the start of a war that would quickly subsume the entire European continent. We do know, however, that she quickly found her way back to Paris, where she volunteered her time at a military hospital treating the wounded and dying. While she was traveling, Lucy had met a young man named Selim Lawrence Schell, who many referred to as Laury. Much like Lucy, Laury Schell had a set of American parents who had raised him abroad. His father was a diplomat, and Laury was born in Geneva before the family moved into a French town just a short trip away from Lucy's birthplace at Brunei. He had studied engineering, but was decidedly uninterested in actually applying himself to a full-time job. He was, however, imbued with the same kind of traveling spirit as Lucy, and when the two met, it was obvious they were about to become inseparable, even when Lucy's father warned her against settling down with a man whose life seems to consist entirely of the pursuit of pleasure. Despite her family's protests, Lucy and Laury were committed to one another. When Zeppelin ships set to bombing Paris in April of 1915, the O'Reilly women returned to the safety of Reading, Pennsylvania, and they brought Laury Schell and his brother along with them. By that point, the two were inseparable. In 1917, they returned to Paris together, where they quickly got married and joined the flood of American expats who had flocked to the City of Lights to cure some of the world weariness that had resulted from the Great War. Though her husband was of slightly more humble means, Lucy O'Reilly Schell could sustain an extravagant lifestyle for the both of them. In 1921, they welcomed a son named Harry into the world, and 5 years later came Philippe. But nothing about motherhood threatened to slow her down. Not when she was one of the many people who had discovered the thrill of speed. As we've discussed here before on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, World War I really transformed our relationship to the automobile. Cars grew more standardized, more powerful, and more reliable, and they were made available at an ever-growing scale. If you were a person of means, as the Shells were, then it was almost expected that you would have at least one automobile of your own. And if you were adventurous, as the Shells were, then there was a very good chance you would end up taking your car out to some form of competition. In the late 1920s, motorsport was growing ever more popular in Europe, and you were certain to have your pick of hill climbs, city-to-city rallies, record attempts, or major events at purpose-built circuits if you wanted a way to spend a weekend. The Shells first started attending these motorsport events as spectators, but it didn't take long before Lucy decided that she needed to try her hand at one of these competitions. Her first recorded event took place in 1927 at the Montlhéry Autodrome outside of Paris. This purpose-built oval will come to play an ever greater role in her racing career, but that day she simply got her feet wet at the track's first ever Journée Féminine de l'Automobile, or the First Ladies' Day. In an instant, she was hooked. France did boast quite a few early women racers, like Camille Dugast and Helen Van Zuylen, but culturally it was massively different from the United States, which was going through a sea change in terms of the expectations about what women should do and be. To illustrate that, I want to pull a passage from Neil Bascom's incredible book Faster, which I think really paints a vivid picture of the kinds of things that O'Reilly Schell was up against. While women in America had already won the right to vote, they remained disenfranchised in France. The emancipated flapper, who wore her hair in a bob, skirt above the knee, and did as she liked, was largely a myth. Promiscuity was likened to prostitution, contraception was a rarity, and abortions were forbidden. Women were largely expected to produce children, keep house, and do as their husbands or parents told them. Well-to-do women were certainly not expected to work for money, and any labor they did was to be performed as dames de charité, or ladies of charity. In her life every day, Lucy had to fight this model of what she ought to be. And just because I'm in a quoting mood, I want to pull from another book. In his autobiography, My Two Lives, racer René Dreyfus described Lucy in such beautiful detail that I have to include it almost in full. Lucy O'Reilly Schell was an American, so was her husband Laury. Marvelous people both, but it was Lucy who fascinated me. She was the daughter of an impoverished Irishman who had emigrated to the United States and made a great deal of money. Lucy O'Reilly had married Laury Schell in America, and they were now living the good life of wealthy American expatriates in Europe, an apartment in Paris, a villa in Monte Carlo. Laury Schell was handling Lucy's inheritance, investing the money in an American stock market. I remember many of his calls to Wall Street brokerage houses, and I believe, too, that he worked as a salesman for a small carrossier in Paris called Baxter. This was probably less for the money than that it brought the Shells close to cars. They were both crazy about them. Lucy looked very Irish, a flawlessly clear complexion, rosy cheeks, the solid build, a face and demeanor more countryside than salon. She could have been a housewife in Killarney, but there was more that was American about her, at least I thought so. She was assertive, forceful, aggressive, and since these were qualities one seldom found in European women, French women particularly, I assumed they were entirely native to that huge country across the Atlantic. What Lucy wanted, Lucy got, and not by wile, but by will. There was no question but that she was absolutely equal partner to Laury in their marriage. There was no subservience about her, no unanswering obeisance, no pipe and slippers. Instead, she was the driving force of the family. That was unheard of on the continent. That had to be American. So here she was, this fantastic, determined American woman fully prepared to take on the best of the continent every time she got behind the wheel of a race car. One of her first outings in 1927 saw her finish 12th in the Grand Prix de Delahaye, and she was determined to return to the event the following year with a better car, in this case a Bugatti T37A, in hopes of bettering her performance. She did just that by finishing 8th. With a taste of success on her tongue, she continued racing around France, finishing 6th at the Grand Prix de la Marne before taking her first ever victory in the Coupe de Bourgogne Vacherette race. Even though photographers from newspapers around Europe effectively refused to print images of Lucy O'Reilly Schell in her overalls, instead preferring she dress to the nines and poise in her finery, Lucy never lacked grit. It's said that at one point she broke her arm in several places just before she was supposed to compete in a race. Her doctor advised her to withdraw, but Lucy refused. Boasting a thick plaster cast, she staged a fierce battle for a win that didn't quite come to fruition, but it was the kind of performance that bolstered her perception in the eyes of the motorsport world. And with that penchant for pushing herself to the limits, one of Lucy's true passions was the Monte Carlo Rally. The Monte Carlo Rally was first held in 1911, and while the name may suggest that it takes place in the Principality of Monaco, that's only part of the situation. If you know literally anything about Monaco, you know that it is a very tiny little region. There's nowhere to host a rally of any substance or distance. Instead, Prince Albert I, who dreamed up this grand idea, decided that the race would merely end in Monaco. But where would it start? Well, that depends, because this really wasn't a rally in the competitive sense we know it to be today, at least not at first. It was more of a pleasure cruise, and that was very strictly enforced with a 7-mile-per-hour average speed. Rather than race full bore, drivers were encouraged to take their time and soak in the sights all around Europe. To do that, all the entrants were given different starting points around the continent, cities like Paris, Brussels, and Berlin, and were told to take off from there. There was technically a winner of that first running of the Monte Carlo Rally, but I can't say it'd be a winner in any sense that we would recognize today. The goal was more about evaluating the comfort of the car than the hard-charging skill of the driver. The appeal of the genteel road trip soon gave way to something far more daring and complex. Race organizers still wanted drivers to start from various points in Europe to converge in Monte Carlo, but they also made sure that these starting points were equidistant from Monte Carlo so that in theory everyone would face the same challenge, though of course some drivers had more mountains, rivers, and poor roads to contend with than others. And instead of being restricted to a slow crawl, drivers were encouraged to race as hard as possible. By 1925, drivers were even starting the Monte Carlo Rally outside of Europe. Back then, in an era where the automobile was not as prevalent throughout Europe as it is today, this was a unique challenge. Depending on your starting location, huge swaths of your trip were sure to take place far away from civilization. To compensate, competitors needed to ensure that they were carrying plenty of supplies like gasoline, spare tires, and tools that they would need to make repairs on the road. If you happened to break down near a prominent city with a repair shop, that was great, but you were far more likely to encounter problems out on a rutted rural road, where any locals that were there probably had never seen a race car like it. The extent of their assistance probably came to an end after helping drag a car out of a sticky situation. Lucy O'Reilly Schell was positively entranced by the event, which she entered and won in the female division in 1929. That was all well and good, but what she really wanted was to compete as equals with the finest male competitors of the day. She would do so multiple times throughout her career, probably most notably in 1932. She and her husband Laury elected to start their rally from Umeå, Sweden, and brought along a reporter named Jacques Marciac to send regular dispatches to French newspaper Le Journal. Readers all across France would be able to keep tabs on the couple racing their Bugatti at high speed toward one of Europe's most glamorous locations. In the book Faster by Neil Bascom, Marciac is described as ballast. Sweden was only one of the 19 locations available for starters to choose from, but it was one of the most challenging. Had the Shells opted to start from Athens or Palermo, they and their journalistic ballast would have been able to count on mild temperatures and, at the worst, rainfall. As it was, they opted for the second longest route that would see them need to hit an average speed of 25 miles per hour as they departed a small town 100 miles north of the Arctic Circle. It would be, frankly, an epic 2,300-mile adventure. The Shells took the start in the wee hours of the morning on January 16th. Sweden, in the thick of winter, was coated with a foot-deep layer of ice on top of which drifts of snow routinely formed. Their Bugatti T44 was far better suited for comfortable cruises around the French countryside, and the idea of a woman driver, while not entirely unheard of, was at least enough to give men like Jacques Marciac a moment's pause. As it would turn out, he'd have nothing to worry about. Lucy O'Reilly Schell took on as much of the driving as her husband Laury, often taking off the mileage at a greater speed than her spouse could have managed. At most, they would pull off to the side of the road for an hour's nap, but it was more likely that the Shells would take turns drifting off in the back seat. And even in a state of sheer exhaustion, Lucy was transcendent. 96 hours after launching into the start of the race, the Shells arrived in Monte Carlo in the middle of a downpour. Though they were surely exhausted and had finished 7th overall, Marciac wrote that the couple nevertheless stepped out of the car swaggering like conquering heroes. The reporter's 5-part saga detailing the excursion was a huge hit. If you were active in the motorsport community of the era, or if you were a member of wealthy high society, you almost certainly knew and respected Lucy O'Reilly Schell. But Marciac's reporting in Le Journal introduced her to an even wider audience. The French were left charmed by her. Indeed, Marciac made it easy by painting a picture of this loving and yet daring couple, equal parts American and French, who seemed to delight in testing their limits. Marciac wrote that he was particularly struck by how Lucy's smile widened the tougher the conditions became. If he had begun the journey worried about O'Reilly Schell's skill behind the wheel, he had ended it a fan. To conclude his series in Le Journal, Jacques Marciac wrote, "The dream has ended. Life must resume." But that wasn't the case for Lucy O'Reilly Schell. At no point did she take a break from competition. She was a regular feature at major events all around Europe throughout the 1930s. She won the Ladies' Cup at the Paris-Nice Criterium in 1934 and 35. She set the fastest times at multiple speed tests at Monte. She and Laury took an impressive second place in the 1936 Monte Carlo Rally, coming across the finish line less than a second behind the winner, and you could regularly find her in the top 10 at the Pau Grand Prix. Of course she loved racing. There was nothing that brought Lucy O'Reilly Schell such a thrill. But she had far bigger dreams and even greater aspirations. Her own ability to race was limited by the fact that she was a woman. She could afford the best cars and could travel to countless races, but there was simply no guarantee she'd actually be allowed to enter unless there was an all-female event taking place. The slow creep of fascism over Europe, too, had begun to concern her. Lucy O'Reilly Schell had witnessed the devastation of World War I. She was a smart woman who could see that the tensions never disappeared. Instead, they morphed and simmered and festered in ways that became ever harder to ignore as the 1930s progressed. Germany was growing in power. You could see it in the new Chancellor Adolf Hitler's direct support of the auto industry in his country. It's not like Lucy Schell knew that the support there was directly tied to Hitler's desire to remilitarize Germany in direct defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, but she absolutely would have been able to understand the country's direct support of vehicle evolution would be sure to have an impact. And it was her desire to see France reach that same level that saw Lucy O'Reilly Schell make her next major move. In 1937, Lucy O'Reilly Schell had already established a cosmopolitan life when she suddenly found herself, at age 40, inheriting the entirety of her father's handsome fortune following his death. With her children mostly grown, her family established, Lucy and Laury Schell put their heads together to find the ideal way to utilize their new funds, by forming their own race team. Part of that was inspired by a contest called the Prix du Million. Last year on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, we really dug into the various ways that Nazi Germany's state investment in the racing programs of Mercedes and Auto Union transformed both the motorsport scene as well as the scope of World War II. In effect, Third Reich Chancellor Adolf Hitler announced in 1933 that he would provide 500,000 Reichsmarks to any German automaker entering the international motorsport scene. Hitler knew that more advanced racing technology translated directly into more advanced military technology. He was also keenly aware of the emotional side of this, how great it would be for Germans to feel pride in their country, and how awful the rest of the world would feel when they were consistently beaten by Germany's unstoppable drivers and machines. But what had started as a 500,000 Reichsmark prize quickly became near-complete government subsidization, and Grand Prix racing was being positively dominated by Germany. France considered itself the mother of auto racing, so this was particularly painful. It was being demolished at its own game, and something needed to change. So in 1937, the French Popular Front, which was an alliance of left-wing movements in France dedicated to anti-fascism and social reform, announced the Prix du Million, or the Million Franc race. As the name implies, the French automaker who developed a car capable of conquering a challenging time trial at the Autodrome de Montlhéry would be awarded 1 million francs, which it could use to subsidize its racing in the future. The funds themselves were raised when the government added a 10-franc fee to all newly issued driver's licenses, as well as through sponsorships from automotive companies. It was to catch the imagination of the French public as no other motor racing event had succeeded in doing either before or since, wrote one historian. A drama on the national scale playing on some of the deepest human instincts and emotions, passion for sport, admiration of skill and prowess, love of country, and all brought to the boil in a cauldron fired by that most magical of all motivators, lust for money. In the trial itself, each car needed to drive 16 laps around the formidable Montlhéry circuit, which totaled 120 miles or 200 kilometers. Those laps needed to be completed at an average speed of at least 91 miles per hour or 146 kilometers per hour, and drivers would need to hit that average from a standing start by August 31st, 1937. The Shells had already established a close relationship with a French manufacturer called Delahaye, which first got started back in the 1890s when founder Émile Delahaye swapped a livelihood building machines for the brick trade for building automobiles. His major debut came at the 1896 Paris-Marseille-Paris road race. The Type 1 that competed in the event was the first fully French-made car in existence during an era where other automakers like Peugeot were fitting German Daimler engines in their road-going machines. Delahaye was keen on maintaining a sense of national pride. He built both the chassis itself as well as a 6-horsepower 2-cylinder engine mounted in the rear of it. When it finished that Paris to Marseille to Paris road race, it proved itself to be a monument of reliability, and the company quickly began taking orders for its debut machine. But by 1902, Delahaye had dropped out of motorsport. It had a thriving business building fairly boring road cars as well as commercial vehicles, and it maintained that very conservative mindset into the 1920s. In an era where innovations in mass production had enabled competitors to produce cheaper cars, Delahaye insisted upon producing its pricey, somber vehicles the same way it always had. But coming into the 30s, it realized that it needed to make some fairly dramatic changes if it wanted to keep pace with the times. Enter a modified version of the Type 103, which featured a light chassis and a hefty truck engine. When a driver took it out to Montlhéry for testing, it didn't set any records, but it did impress upon the automotive world that Delahaye was once again looking to innovate in the world of motorsport. Still, critics considered it perfect for just about one application: leading off a funeral procession. Not long after, Lucy and Laury Schell arrived at Delahaye's Rue de Banquier factory in Paris, inquiring about purchasing a machine for the 1934 Monte Carlo rally. It was Lucy O'Reilly Schell who did the negotiating. She wanted Delahaye to start with its Super Lux machine, but she wanted it to effectively build a car that didn't yet exist by taking the V6 engine from one car and placing it in the chassis of a smaller car. At first, Delahaye claimed it would be too much of a challenge for its already time-pressed engineers, but the red-haired woman in his office carried the kind of magnetic personality that soon had the company agreeing to her request, so long as she was willing to pay for the pleasure. Lucy would. In fact, in order to force Delahaye to give her the priority of a recurring customer, she placed 12 orders for a brand new model called the 135. From that moment on, Lucy O'Reilly Schell made the swap from Talbot-produced racing machines to Delahaye. Why Delahaye? Why opt for a company that had a reputation for building high-quality but otherwise uninspiring and frankly outdated machines? Part of it had to do with a simple lack of options. The French auto industry had been booming once. Over 350 different companies had sprung up around the country at the dawn of the automobile, but the Great Depression had killed off most of those outfits. Peugeot, Citroën, and Renault, the three biggest automakers at the time, were just barely scratching out a living, and that was largely because they had found success in high-volume production. Delahaye, by contrast, was facing mass layoffs or even failure without something to revive its fortunes. It's likely that those dire straits are what convinced Lucy Schell to choose Delahaye in the first place. The brand was one with an impressive and long-standing legacy in French motorsport. Even if it hadn't competed for decades when the Shells approached to place an order, Delahaye represented something critical to the French racing scene. Lucy believed the company had what it took, and she was always on the lookout for an underdog and a way to pay homage to her beloved France. When Delahaye proved it could provide her with a competent car, she knew she could begin asking for more. She and Laury raced the Delahaye 135 in the 1936 Monte Carlo rally. That year, they started from Acropolis and finished just 0.4 of a second shy of the winner. But by this point, Lucy was nearing 40 years of age. She felt her competitive edge had been eroding away, and she also felt the hot breath of the Nazi Party on the back of her neck. Having served as a nurse in Paris during the early days of World War I, she had seen the destruction that could be caused by the Germans. She'd kept an eye on the movements of the fascists since the rise of Hitler, and she could clearly understand that the domination of German automakers in Grand Prix racing signaled far more than mere success at racing. It was a promise of domination to come. So when the AIACR, the French sanctioning body that served as a progenitor to the FIA, announced a new Grand Prix rule set for 1937 designed to bring a challenge to the might of the German-backed automakers, Lucy O'Reilly Schell decided the time had come for her to step out of the cockpit and to step into a new role as a team owner. Lucy had already established a team called the Blue Buzz a few years prior, but it had never expanded beyond competing in the occasional sports car race or rally. Not until Schell decided to approach Delahaye with a request to build a Nazi-challenging Grand Prix car for the 1937-39 regulatory period. At that point, she rebranded the outfit. It would now be called the Curie Blue, or the Blue Team, a reference to the powdery national shade that adorned all French-entered race cars in that era. And she was determined that she and Delahaye could bolster French prestige in the racing scene by bringing a major fight to the Germans. But first would have to come the million-franc prize. With the announcement of the million-franc prize, formal announcements of intent came from Talbot and Ceefack, with Bugatti and Delahaye soon joining in, albeit with some reservations about the nature of the competition, whose rules seemed to be drafted up in such a way as to enable a bureaucratic fight between French automakers on a more level playing field, as opposed to an all-out battle for performance that the Germans had been waging on all of Europe. But even then, it was a battle. It was a battle that Lucy O'Reilly Schell and her Curie Blue team were careful to prepare for. As Delahaye began construction of a new car called the 145, which would take on that challenge, Lucy began the hunt for a driver to pilot her car not only in the million-franc prize, but who would also serve as a steady hand in the Grand Prix scene. That wouldn't be an easy feat. For as beloved as Lucy was among certain segments of the racing scene, it was still an intensely patriarchal scene, and few of the established drivers would dare be seen taking orders from a woman, even if that woman was a competent team boss. She would need to hire someone without existing ties to a race team, and many of the best talents had already been snapped up by the Germans. She also needed someone hungry. And that's how Lucy O'Reilly Schell came to settle on René Dreyfus. Born in Nice back in 1905, Dreyfus had been racing professionally since he was 20 years old and had already snagged some impressive victories, including at races like the Monaco and Belgian Grand Prix. Unfortunately, he'd never really found a team to settle into and had bounced between the likes of Maserati, Ferrari, and Talbot Lago. For as successful as he could be, he also found himself limited in an increasingly fascist and anti-Semitic Europe. Dreyfus was born to a Jewish family, and although he wasn't a practicing Jew, he was still a Jew. Racing for a German or Italian team by 1937 was out of the question. He hadn't been happy at stints with Bugatti or Talbot Lago. There were few options left, so when Lucy O'Reilly Schell came calling, Dreyfus was willing to hear her out. Even though he initially worried that he'd been sold a dream, he also knew that he had no other options, and he began preparing for both the racing season and the million-franc prize with a Delahaye-backed Curie Blue. As the 145s entered production, Lucy kept Dreyfus busy. In January, she sent him off to compete in his first Monte Carlo rally alongside her husband, Laury. They finished 5th. In February, Dreyfus would compete in the Pau Grand Prix and take a strong 3rd place, though the winner would be his Bugatti arch-rival in the million-franc prize, Jean-Pierre Wamy. Lucy entered him in his first Mille Miglia in April, where he flipped his car. She entered him in the 24 Hours of Le Mans, where Dreyfus's mad dash after a lengthy repair nevertheless saw the team finish 3rd. And in the spring, when he hadn't been contracted for Curie Blue races, Dreyfus would join Maserati for a handful of events. Come late June, though, was the official launch of the Delahaye 145. It was not the handsome machine of Delahaye's past. Some critics claimed it looked more like the snub-nosed bulldogs that Lucy loved than a proper race car. Even René Dreyfus said it was the most awful-looking car I ever saw. In early tests at Monte, it did look promising, and then it began to face a litany of problems, like overheating, a misfiring engine, chronic spark plug failure, and a handful of crashes. Dreyfus put the machine through its paces during a few summertime Grand Prix, but the 145 was far from perfect when Lucy O'Reilly Schell made the decision that it was time to attempt the million-franc prize. So at the end of July 1937, the Écurie Bleu organization set up shop at Monte, replete with stacks of Dunlop tires and enough spare parts to see them through, hopefully, to the finish of the challenge. And Lucy O'Reilly Schell was determined that everyone would remain firmly in place until the challenge was won. In her mind, the best way to prepare René Dreyfus for the affair would be to get him onto the track as quickly as possible to learn the ins and outs of the 12.5-kilometer course, composed of both an interior road section as well as a banked oval. Many of the other major challengers had already thrown up their hands to admit defeat. All but one, Bugatti. The Bugatti camp was taking a decidedly different approach, staying holed up at its factory in Mulsanne, France, until it had crafted a perfect speed machine. Only then would it make the trek to Monte in hopes of winning the 1 million franc prize. And as July bled into August and flocks of French citizens left their day jobs for an annual vacation, there was plenty of time for interest to rocket to life as the deadline creeped ever closer. The Écurie Bleu team continued logging laps. Bugatti announced that it would make its first attempt at snatching the prize on August 12th. The mechanical problems postponed that effort for 2 days, only for the team's drivers to be involved in a major road accident on their way to the track. While the 2 men in the car did live, they needed a lengthy stay in the hospital. There would be no record attempt in their future, so as a result, Bugatti scrambled to find a replacement, which it did in the form of Robert Benoit. Strong winds forced Benoit to abandon his first attempt after 12 laps. In his next, on August 23rd, his first 2 laps were so concerningly slow, and he ultimately finished his attempt 9 seconds above the roughly 1 hour and 21-minute completion time that would represent accomplishing the primary regulations set out by the organizers. René Dreyfus, though, was nervous. His Delahaye 145 was running well, even though he began to imagine plenty of little gremlins plaguing him. He had turned enough laps that he'd discovered every secret to trimming time that Monte offered. And despite the fact that he had consistently increased his performance, he had still failed to lap the circuit within the expected time. But as the deadline was just days away, Delahaye and Écurie Bleu encouraged Dreyfus to make a run. Weather-wise, conditions were perfect, and Bugatti was talking about making another shot at the record. With just 4 days remaining until the deadline, Dreyfus needed to perform. And perform he did. On August 27, 1937, René Dreyfus completed the Prix du Million behind the wheel of Écurie Bleu's Delahaye 145 in what was a major landmark moment for the team, driver, manufacturer, and nation. It was the culmination of a massive effort helmed by one of motorsport's most audacious women, and the celebrations were immense. However, it should go without saying that the Prix du Million did not necessarily have its intended impact. As French automakers poured ample resources into crafting a car that could be absolutely dominant at Monte for those trials, German automakers continued to pour resources into their overall racing program, and the German government never hesitated to dole out its equivalent of 1 million francs anytime it saw fit. What should have been a unifying moment for French motorsport effectively became a convenient diversion that allowed Germany to continue its dominance. That much was clear when it came to splitting the prize money. Lucy O'Reilly Schell and Delahaye both took equal shares of the 1 million francs, and O'Reilly split her portion with driver René Dreyfus. What had once seemed like an unthinkable amount of money had been whittled away, a mere drop in the bucket compared to what German teams could do. In October of 1937, that was brought home even further when French President Albert Lebrun arrived at the Grand Palais des Champs-Élysées to inaugurate the beginning of that year's Salon de l'Automobile. He toured each carefully prepared exhibit, taking a moment to pay homage to the million-winning Delahaye 145 that sat smack in the center of the Grand Palais, a sort of rallying cry for the future of the French automotive industry. Lebrun asked a few questions, then he moved on. In sum, he spent 1/2 hour at the event. Again, if you tuned into our DPTJ episodes on the Nazi Party's involvement in the auto industry last season, then you can see just how stark the contrast is here between Lebrun and Hitler. The 1933 Berlin Motor Show, hosted just days after the Nazi Party seized control of Germany, was inaugurated with a rousing speech by new Chancellor Adolf Hitler. This new leader used that speech to call for an all-out effort to motorize Germany, which meant introducing tax benefits for car owners, calling on manufacturers to build an affordable car for the masses, and encouraging major players to get more involved in racing. It was a frankly genius move on the propaganda front, and it was only the beginning of Germany's major investments in both road cars and race cars. It took just one speech for the country's new leadership to cement mobility as one of its key motivating factors. Albert Lebrun's half-hearted peep at the finest machinery France had to offer, even after the drama of the Prix du Million, served to emphasize just how little this nation truly understood the importance of motorsport and mobility when it came to fostering everything from technological excellence to national pride. But there was no time to worry about that. There was more racing to be done. And in fact, 1938 would be a year of triumph for Akiri Blue, if only in small ways. Despite the death of German ace Bernd Rosemeyer in a wreck while attempting a speed record, the Nazi-backed teams of Mercedes and Auto Union were considered favorites. At the Pau Grand Prix, though, there were new rules in effect that would limit both engine size and the size of the field for what was a non-championship event, meaning it didn't count for the European Championship. But it was there that René Dreyfus took victory for Akiri Blue. The Delahaye's V12 engine simply consumed less fuel than that of the thirsty German machines, and he was able to complete all 100 laps of the race without having to make a pit stop. The Parisian press was ecstatic. Journalist Charles Theroux wrote that one cannot congratulate Delahaye enough for having beaten a rival as redoubtable as Mercedes-Benz. Could this be the dawn of a resurrection? In Paris Soir, one writer gave a response. The success achieved in Pau by René Dreyfus and Delahaye thus marks the revival of the French sports industry. Others hailed Dreyfus himself as a divine avenger. But victory would not come again, and Lucy O'Reilly Schell had her eyes elsewhere. In 1939, the Shells had begun early negotiations to bring their race cars to the United States in hopes of competing in the Indianapolis 500-mile sweepstakes, when tragedy struck. The couple were involved in a major car wreck driving from their villa in Monte Carlo, losing control on rainy conditions in the small town of Pont-Saillon. Both Lucy and Laury were injured and rushed to the Saint Raphael Clinic in Paris. Though his injuries initially didn't seem serious, Laury Schell suddenly found that he was unable to move the left side of his body. Doctors performed brain surgery, hoping to rectify the problem, and his condition got worse. On October 16, 1939, he died. Lucy herself was seriously injured, nursing her wounds after the crash as others buried her husband. She was physically unable to attend the funeral herself. Akiri Blue had commissioned a new car, the 155, that had teething problems. The Nazis invaded Poland. France declared war. We can't know what was going through Lucy's head. In 1938, the world was at her fingertips. Less than a year later, it had all fallen apart. She still had her team, and she still had René Dreyfus, but the hopes of competing in a European Grand Prix season crumbled in the face of war. And Dreyfus, too, was suffering. In January of 1940, he lost his beloved mother, and at the wake, Lucy Schell informed him that she'd be sending him to America. Akiri Blue would be entering the Indianapolis 500 with two cars, one for Dreyfus and one for fellow Frenchman René Lebesgue. Neither of the Renés believed it. They knew that they were going to have to serve their country. They were going into the military. And yet Lucy Schell somehow managed to wrangle permission from high command to send both men overseas. They would indeed be racing in the 1940 Indianapolis 500. In the build-up to the event, team manager, interpreter, and journalist for the French magazine Lotto, Bernard Musnick, sent a wire to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway on May 11th that read, "3 drivers are extremely colorful. Presumed Dreyfus and Lebesgue temporarily demobilized through special government dispensation to represent France in the United States race. Believe Canetti an Italian national, though he has long years of residence in France. Understand 3 arriving in New York on SS Comte de Savoie on May 23rd. While the international travel was far easier in 1940 than it had ever been, it still took 9 days for the Comte de Savoie liner to arrive in New York City. at which point the crew was required to take an airplane to Indiana. Still, they arrived just in time. Their ship was the last to depart Italy from America before the tensions of the war truly grew unbearable. As they traveled, Germany invaded France, Paris fell, and a return to France seemed almost impossible for any of the travelers, particularly for Dreyfus, a Jewish man. On May 24, 1940, O'Reilly Schell, her son Harry, team mechanic Luigi Chinetti, and drivers René Dreyfus and René Lebesgue arrived at Indianapolis. The drivers had swapped their soldiers' uniforms for racing overalls for just a handful of days before they were expected to return home and continue on with the fight. Upon their arrival at the airport in Indy, a band played the French national anthem for a crowd of several thousand people keen on catching sight of the much-revered female team owner and the drivers who were postponing their duty to their country to compete in the biggest motorsport event in the world. Lebesgue tasked team manager and interpreter Bernard Musnick to tell assembled interviewees that the most touching thing about the entire trip was the reception when they arrived. Chinetti claimed that the drivers had asked the American Airlines pilot to circle the speedway a few times before landing, just so that they could huddle up against the window and start to figure out their lines through the corners. Asked about the war, both drivers replied, "We are certain France is going to win." The French contingent received a warm welcome, not just from the band, but from countless major players at the Indy 500. A police escort to their hotel followed, as people lining the streets cried, "Vive la France!" The two men had left behind their military units, but they claimed that their departure was actually something of a morale booster for their comrades in arms, who were reported to be wild with enthusiasm at the prospect of their fellow soldiers representing France at the Indy 500. "It is for them, too, that we will do our best," the two men said. Dreyfus tried his hand at broken English by telling the press, "Tomorrow morning I desire to seize the track." The race was set to take place 6 days later, on May 30th. Come the morning of May 26th, the full crew headed to the office of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, located on North Capitol Avenue, to liaise with Pop Myers, general manager of the track. They snagged their credentials and headed to the circuit. It was something of a culture shock for almost everyone in the group, including the wife of René Lebesgue, who learned upon her arrival in the city that women were banned from the pits and garages at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Normally, she would be in the pits, which she told media was a custom of many wives in Europe. But nevertheless, she still had a favorable impression of Indianapolis, which she said looked very much like heaven when they had arrived the night before. The Indy outing, though, would be something of a disaster, and the language barrier was Dreyfus's downfall. In qualifying, he felt it would be best to drive safely under the belief that every driver entered in the event would be allowed to make the start. If you know anything about Indianapolis, you know that that's not the case. When there are more than 33 cars entered in the race, then the slowest cars are bumped from the field. And with 45 drivers entered, Dreyfus would have needed to push harder than he had, and only discovered he wouldn't start the race until the session was completed. René Lebesgue, for his own part, qualified 31st on the final row of the grid. During the race itself, Lebesgue was one of several drivers who found the strain of the Indianapolis 500 to be too much to bear on his own. He pulled into the pits on 2 different occasions to turn his Maserati over to René Dreyfus. The two were classified 10th in the final standings. After the race, Lucy O'Reilly Schell decided that her foray as a major team owner had come to a close. She sold both of her Maseratis to racing driver turned team owner Lou Moore, who had managed to take 5 Indy 500 victories as an entrant, and who became the first man to take 3 consecutive victories as an owner. He rebranded the Maseratis as the Elgin Piston Pin Specials. Rather than return to France after the event, René Dreyfus and Luigi Chinetti made the decision to remain in the United States. It was a particularly challenging decision for Dreyfus, who spoke very little English, but who quickly found himself hired by a small restaurant owner. With a hand from Schell, Dreyfus acquired his American citizenship and even went so far as to enlist in the U.S. Army, which brought him back to Europe to serve. There he reunited with his family and quickly made arrangements for them to join him in America. Together with his brother Maurice, René Dreyfus established the extremely popular Le Chanticleer restaurant in New York City, which became the de facto hub of racing enthusiasts traveling in and out of America. The later stages of Lucy O'Reilly Schell's life have slipped from the history books, and if you're a longtime listener of DPTJ, that probably won't surprise you. Many of the groundbreaking men in motorsport history have had the luxury of mythologizing themselves or of being mythologized by others who knew and respected them. But once the women in the racing scene stepped away from the spotlight, they were often entirely forgotten. I'm thinking of people like Kimi Dugas, Cheryl Glass, and even more controversial figures like Helenice. Once these women retired from active racing, they largely fell off the map, and it can be a challenge to track down what happened next. That's the case here as well. Some reports state that Lucy O'Reilly Schell remained in America until the conclusion of World War II, while others say that she returned to Nazi-occupied Paris in 1941, missing the city she called home. While she herself stepped away from racing, she did support her sons in their pursuit of a career in motorsport. Then at age 55, on a Sunday, June 8, 1952, Lucy O'Reilly Schell met her end in a villa she was said to be sharing with a sister named Henriette Henke in Monte Carlo. Being an only child, it isn't clear if Henriette was a sister-in-law or some other relation, but someone was there to take care of Lucy until the very end, when heart failure claimed her life. Initially interred at the Monte Carlo Cemetery, O'Reilly Schell's remains were moved to the cemetery in Brunei, France. There she was reinterred alongside her late husband and later both of their sons, Philippe and Harry. Both young men competed in racing, albeit for differing periods of time. There are only a handful of known entries for Philippe Schell, and it appears that his racing career concluded in 1951. He would live until 1991, when he passed away at age 65. Harry Schell had truly caught the racing bug. He began competing in 1946, getting a start in America by trying to qualify for the Indianapolis 500. When he failed to make that happen, he moved to Europe to begin competing in lower disciplines of open-wheel racing. When the Formula One World Championship was founded in 1950, Schell was the only American driver to compete in several selections of the Grand Prix in Europe. When it came to talent, Schell did admittedly leave something to be desired. He was never truly spectacular and only secured 2 podiums and 56 Formula One starts, but he did become a beloved member of the paddock. Harry Schell made the most of his international racing career by becoming a renowned playboy, but on the track he was known as a safe and reliable competitor, not the kind of man to win races, but the kind of man who could be counted on in terms of predictability, and who used his position to advocate for greater safety measures. He was active in racing up to 1960. Even though he was nearly 40 years of age, he had secured a full-season F1 seat with the British Racing Partnership team. Unfortunately, he was killed during practice for a non-championship race at Silverstone. While traveling at over 100 miles per hour, he dipped a wheel into some mud beside the track, lost a tire, and subsequently lost control. His Cooper flipped, pierced through a safety barrier, and smashed into a brick wall. Yet Lucy O'Reilly Schell's legacy tends to be forgotten. But why? Why are we so quick to write women out of motorsport history? First and foremost, I feel like it's worth pointing out here that, of course, this is not just a problem of perception. Research has shown that women occupy just 0.5% of all recorded history. For every 200 men history remembers, it will remember 1 woman. It's not just because men are somehow innately better or more accomplished. It's because we have traditionally lived in a society that places men in the spotlight. We assume more of men. We also expect very little of women, to the extent where a woman's contributions are often credited to a man, and to an extent where successful women are nevertheless expected to support the men in their lives. We've lived in this system for generations, which is why it tends to reinforce itself. If you don't believe women can be great, then you won't provide them the means to reach their potential, nor will you be inclined to view and record their accomplishments as such. If you don't believe me, let's look at some examples. Chemist Rosalind Franklin was the first person to capture photographs revealing the structure of DNA. But 2 men, James Watson and Francis Crick, took the photo that Franklin developed to create their own double helix DNA model, for which they received the Nobel Prize. History remembers Zelda Fitzgerald as a madwoman, but her husband, F. Scott Fitzgerald, allegedly stole passages from her diaries and letters to publish in his own highly regarded works. Even Simon Cowell takes credit for putting together the band One Direction, when there is now footage to prove that one of his X Factor UK co-hosts, Nicole Scherzinger, was actually the mastermind behind the group. And these are only some of the examples, ones we know about. The women who could either advocate for themselves or who could be rightfully credited because there existed some record of their accomplishments. It's worth noting that most of our examples are white women because women of color have faced even greater exclusion from history. And there are centuries upon centuries of incredible women accomplishing great things, and we will never, ever hear about them. In motorsport, we still see this in action. When I have written about women like Cammy Dugast, I've had people demand to know why her story matters. If you look at the cold facts, I suppose you can see where the argument comes from. Dugast competed in exactly 2 races, so how can we claim she was a racer? And if she didn't win anything, how can we consider her great or influential? If you zoom out a little bit, as I did in my Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys episode on Dugast, the reality becomes clear. She was competing in an era where women were still supposed to be the so-called angel of the house, which meant women were supposed to be quiet, self-sacrificing, graceful, and devoted to their husbands. They were not supposed to have ambitions beyond having children, and they certainly were not expected to compete in sport against men. You'll realize that Dugast could be different because she came from wealth and married into it, because she had a husband who indulged her adventurous streak, and because she became a widow not long after marriage. You realize Dugast only had 2 opportunities to race, because women were banned after the 1903 Paris to Madrid rally, in which countless accidents, none of them caused by a woman behind the wheel, resulted in a banning of women from motorsport. Reducing her importance in the grand scheme of racing history because she didn't regularly race is like trying to claim a baby is stupid because it doesn't know how to read a novel. You're evaluating the person in question by a metric that is fundamentally unavailable to them. Lucy O'Reilly Schell may not be the first woman to ever race a car or the first woman to ever run a team, but her fearlessness, tenacity, and strength set her apart as a true trailblazer in the racing space, particularly when it came to European Grand Prix racing and her determination to have a successful racing organization. I don't think it can be overstated just what a challenge Schell had before her at almost every single point in her life. She could have easily chosen a simpler path, or cowed to ongoing public pressure. I mean, we are talking about a woman who saw the ways the Nazi Party in Germany had transformed motorsport into a rampant propaganda machine designed to illustrate one country's technical and racial superiority over all others, and who responded by mustering up all the resources she could in order to field a team designed to return at least some glory back to France, and to act as a counter-narrative to some of the ugliest stories being told in motorsport at the time. It's almost insane to think about. One woman assembling a down-home race team designed to take on state-funded monoliths in what was almost always going to be a losing battle. And when the political tides of Europe became overwhelmingly fascist and anti-Semitic, she was there to help a Jewish driver make his way to America for a new beginning. The odds were against her right from the start. Yet at no point did she assume the existence of a barrier meant it wasn't worth trying to climb it. What she was able to accomplish remains groundbreaking when you consider the means at her disposal and the pushback that accompanied her at every step. And that is what makes Lucy O'Reilly Schell a motorsport figure worth remembering. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. I'll be back next month, where once again, we're turning the clocks back to one of the earliest races in motorsport history, the 1909 Ocean-to-Ocean race. This was an event that pitted some of the earliest American automakers against one another to determine superiority, and it involved a little brand called Ford cheating its way to becoming one of the biggest names in the global auto industry. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. Let the algorithm know this is the kind of content you want to see more of. If you're hungry for more fun motorsport history facts, check out DPTJ on social media, and please subscribe to the DPTJ Substack. Every blog is free for everyone, but if you would like to cast a vote in support of this show, please consider upgrading to a paid subscription. I'm also working toward monetization on YouTube. I share weekly short videos that look at various aspects of racing history, as well as every episode of DPTJ. So I would love it if you checked it out. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or sponsorship opportunities, or if you just want to reach out and say hello, I have an email for that. deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Finally, we are ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each show, but you can also find a full list of sources in the episode description. My two biggest references this month were Faster by Neil Bascomb, which, if you haven't read it, is an absolutely phenomenal book, as well as René Dreyfus's autobiography, My Two Lives. There are plenty of other online sources and newspapers that I've pulled from, and those are all available for you to consult in the description. But that's all from me this month. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys.